Today, this final day, it coincides with the commemoration of the oldest member of Hazrat Inayat Khan's family, of which I have personal records, being his maternal grandfather, Maula Bakhsh. That name will be very familiar to you because for very long, even the slightest little biographical mention of Hazrat Inayat Khan, as he gave his concerts or when with certain things in which he had to be made known, always almost in the second line of such a little biographical mention of him, there was always his grandfather's name was also always mentioned. He was the grandson of Maula Bakhsh. Well, in India that would be quite normal because in India, of course, Maula Bakhsh has been a very great name over a very long period. But this was so much Hazrat Inayat Khan's own realization, how much he was connected with, how much he also owed to, how much he represented the great tradition of his grandfather, made that, as I say, wherever he went, wherever anything was mentioned about Hazrat Inayat Khan, it was mentioned of Maula Bakhsh as well. And that, of course, reflects that very close relationship with his maternal grandfather. We'll come back to that. Maybe, but we were telling a few very generalities about Maula Bakhsh because for quite long, little was known about him. That is to say, amongst the brothers, Hazrat Inayat Khan and his brothers, he was a constant presence in their conversation, in their memories, and in their general conversation. It was always that he was there. But we found in the data which were assembled in the biographical department or in the headquarters, there was practically nothing about him, and what was there was not correct. So that was quite something which required some time to correct. In the first place, the interesting part is that you will find in the biography, I believe, maybe even the most recent publication, although that might have been corrected by now, that a certain Anwar Khan was Maula Bakhsh's grandfather, and that he had also been a successful musician. Now, there are a number of things which may easily be confused, because Anwar Khan was Maula Bakhsh's maternal uncle. The strange thing is that we do not really know the name of Maula Bakhsh's mother, but because in those days that was not proper to use personal names. One always avoided using anybody's personal name, or would use a cognomen, a laqab, or use a description of a person rather than an immediate personal name. But it is certain that, well, in the Indian language, there would be a difference. When you speak of an uncle, then there's a different name for a maternal or paternal uncle. But that, of course, escaped the attention of people making notes here in Europe. And so there was this the description of the grandfather on his maternal side was presented as his paternal grandfather. Now, these kind of things, of course, need to be corrected. And another thing was that it was said that he was also a successful musician. But that again needs some qualification, because you all know probably the well-known story that when he was about 15 years of age, he sang he met a Chishtiya or a dervish, and that dervish asked him to sing, and he sang some song. He said, well, I'm not really trained, I don't know it, but I can sing something. And then that dervish was so pleased with him that he said, I'll change your name. There's nothing I can give you. I'll give you a name which will bring you luck. And so he was originally called Shaikh Khan, and then he changed his name to Maula Bakhsh. That was the name which that dervish had given him, and indeed that name carried him throughout India for all his further life. But then the interesting thing is, how did a dervish who happened to pass by the place where Maula Bakhsh lived, why did he suddenly ask that young boy whom he asked for some water, and the place where Maula Bakhsh lived had a flowing source of water, which of course was a very important thing in those days. So Maula Bakhsh gave him that water and had some conversation with him. But that Darwish must have been aware that music was somewhere present in that family. And indeed, as I said, that maternal grandfather of Maula Bakhsh was also a musician. But there again, you get this strange kind of thing. He might have been a musician, but he was not a performer of music. That is one of the strange things you find in that in the history of that time. All these people, both Maula Bakhsh, the ancestry of Maula Bakhsh, but also the family of Hazrat Inayat Khan's father, who came from Punjab, as you know. But they were all in the first place not so much musicians as people who, again, I told you that another day, and nowadays might be people consider rather shocking and prefer not to hear that. But in the Pax Britannica in the 19th century, the imposition of peace, of that states were no longer allowed to be warring with one another. All these princely states, lots of them were, so that Pax Britannica made all these rulers benefited very greatly, because then they became the centers of culture in India. But the same development took place among the landowners. The landowners were all over in India. After all, the only thing, India was a vast country, but the only kind of investment you could make, unless you were in business, which nobody wanted to be, because those days business was not well looked at all. But if people who invested in land, of which in India, fortunately, was plenty. So all over India, you had many, many different kinds of landowners. But then suddenly, again, through British influence, there was one name which was first used in the Bengal, India. Then the British tended to identify the Indian landowners with what they called in England the so-called landed gentry. People who had enough land to live off their income from their land. And that concept they kind of exported when they looked, the 19th century British looked at that Indian kind of landowners class as they had looked at the gentry in England. And so there was one standard name they came up with, first named Zamindar, or landowner, and suddenly all the landowners all over India, with a vast number of names to indicate these kind of people, suddenly all of them became zamindars, meaning, in a very general British kind of sense, the landed gentry. In the same way that the British regarded the Maharajas as a kind of, Indian peers, so the landowners became that kind of landed gentry, was another social factor in England in the 19th century. And so, and the curious thing was that then those people that was spontaneously been living off their land, that suddenly became, throughout India, became kind of institutionalized. And the idea was that you could be a landowner if you had peasants to till the soil. Of course, you should not oneself be involved in the agriculture. You had peasants to do that. And above all, you should not, if you had any extra harvest, you should not be involved in selling that. Being in trade was the worst kind of thing you could do. So you could not trade your land. You had to leave that to certain merchants. And tilling the land, of course, had to be the part of the farmers. So when these two conditions were fulfilled, and there was a certain income, then these people belonged to this landowning class. But for the smaller ones, there was a certain risk involved in land ownership. First, especially the north, the wars had not finished. The British had the Sikh wars, the Afghan wars, etc. So there was still a lot of trouble going on in northern India. And that that means that the land ownership was not all that safe. You could, besides, you could have droughts, you could have wars with your armies running over your territories, you could have all kind of mishaps through which once the yields, the harvest yields were not there. And then what you do as a landowner of which the harvest was not there for that season or for that year. So, especially the smaller landowners always made a point of having some kind of cultural activity which they could cultivate in case of need. They could use that particular specialism which they had developed and which they developed in the observance of culture, but they could then also make it useful in some kind of way. And of course, in the case of both the paternal family and the maternal family of Hazrat Inayat Khan, both had gone for that for the combination. They were, of course, all of them culturally speaking or spiritually speaking, they were all drenched in Persian Sufism. And so, on the one hand, they had that Sufi tradition with, of course, the musical tradition adds to it. As you know, Hazrat Inayat has told it very often, especially the Chistia order, was an order which very much cultivated music and song as part of their order rituals. And so these things were very important for people who wanted to cultivate some kind of security, which was filling their free days with a cultural activity, and in case of need, that cultural activity could be used in a practical way. But then again, those people who cultivated classical music in India could not be performers. You read that also you get some indications also in biography about this. And the dilemma was that then they could do all kinds of things with music. They could practice it, they could have all kinds of ways compose, they could, of course, within certain family circles, they could also sing or play, whatever, but you did not go public. So the classical Indian music was never a concert music in the sense that it was performed publicly. So you always had to find a confined circle of people for whom you, if need arose and you wanted really to play that music professionally, in the sense that it yielded some income because you gave a kind of performance, then of course that had to be a limited group of people. And mostly those were groups of music lovers in the cities or in the smaller towns who really loved Indian classical music and would invite the musicians to come and perform. So they were secure in that confined space, which it was not derogatory to perform in. Or, of course, the best solution was these many Indian courts, which by that time, as I said, thanks to the Pakistanis, were very rich, assembled a lot of money and all tried to collect as many talents as they could to their courts. So again, that was a confined space, that was only a limited group of people to be performed. And then, so that was all right. But there was never a public presentation of music. And I emphasize this because it's precisely Maula Bakhsh who broke through this taboo on making music public in a grand way, but I'll mention that later. There was another factor which especially affected Muslim landowners rather than Hindu ones, because the inheritance laws in among the Muslims in India were Arabic laws. And the Arabic had tribal law. A tribal law meant that an enormous amount of people were entitled to inherit a particular person, not just his children, but all kinds of agnates also had the right to inherit from a person. And in the Arab tribal system, that didn't make some sense because that property never left really the circle of that particular tribe. So it always went just from one person to the tribe to the other, circulated that way. So that didn't create harm and made comparative sense. But that's fine if your properties are small town dwellings, or of course, above all, herds and herds of cattle or sheep or camels, what have you. It was the animal herds and which were the real capital, as today you still find in certain regions in Africa, where cattle is really the main property. But of course, that's fine. You can divide all kinds of sheep and goat and camel, what have you. You can divide them in different areas. You can't do that with land. And of course, India was par excellence a land, country of land. But if you start dividing land between people, then within 2 generations, if not one, all your land will then become diminished so much that nobody benefits from that kind of land holding, which enabled one to be a member of the Zamindari class. So, strangely, what many of the Muslim landowners did was try to avoid the inheritance arrangements of the Islamic law, and rather than try to associate with the Hindu system, because the Hindus, like in Britain itself, had that idea of joint property. You don't divide things. In India, the holdings would be jointly, or like in Britain, one person would inherit, but then he was responsible for the livelihood of everybody else who belonged to that particular family. So the interesting thing is that while a family like Hazrat Inayat Khan's, through the centuries that had been established in India, of course, was very close to Hindu culture as well. They had a very strong Sufi Islamic culture of their own, but still in many ways they were quite close to the Hindu. They were open for it, but in Sufism, it was very open kind of attitude to take to others, and that was already there. And so, but then, of course, you could almost say, and I find it always, there's a certain piquancy to say that. Many people don't find that a rather materialistic point to make for such a revered family. But actually, a family like the Mashaik, the family of Mujtahid Inayat Khan's father, had a kind of, well, an economic interest in associating with the Hindu society. So that openness, that sympathy to the Hindu world was especially great in the case of those Muslim landowners who wanted to avoid Muslim inheritance laws and rather follow the model of the Hindu system, which in India, of course, was possible because the arm of the Sharia was not that strong. Anyway, that was I'm saying this because it's important to realize that music in the first place was a personal culture, like Sufism. It was something which you did because it belonged to your, and it need not be music, it could just as well be religion, it could be poetry, it could be literature, it could all kind of cultural interest and occupations you could take. But once something was tradition in your family, then generally you continue that. And so in Hazrat Inayat Khan's case, on both sides, it was Sufism, which was already present in one form or another, either culturally or spiritually. In the line of Maula Bakhsh, it was mainly culturally. In the line of Inayat Khan himself, it was also spiritually. You all know that his elder maternal uncle was a very practicing mystic as well. So that is the general picture. You get these people who were, as I say, landowners who were, in case of need, able to professionalize their particular cultural activity, and this, in their case, was of course music. That gave them also a special, let us say, well, how would you call it, a special status really in the courts to which they could attach themselves, mostly only for a limited period. They didn't want to be so professional that they attached themselves to the courts permanently. There you get these court musicians who live there for one generation to another. That was what they wanted to avoid. They didn't want these professional court musicians, but they wanted to attach to different courts in the course of their career, and if possible, again, regain more land, invest in more land, and again settle down as a hopefully expanded landowner. But these people generally were very greatly respected if they were really great musicians. And so their music thing, which maybe I already told you, that people like Maula Bakhsh and Hazrat's father, Rahmat Khan, they were known as teachers of the Maharaja. You couldn't possibly say that they were just positions attached to the court, or you couldn't say they were performers of music. No, they were teachers of the Maharaja. No whether the Maharaja ever learned anything at all of those teachers, it doesn't matter, but that was the polite way of referring to them. So anyway, so the same way that Dervish, who gave that name to Maula Bakhsh, must have been aware that that family for which he came in this district were very much committed to music. They were, in fact, people who were indeed very keen on cultivating music, and that Anwar Khan, his so-called, his maternal grandfather, was supposed to be a musician, which he doubtless was, but he was not a musician who ever really performed. He didn't perform in public, and we have no record of his performing in any kind of limited circle also, although that might have been the case. But in any case, when Maula Bakhsh, 3 years after that Dervish had given him that new name, set out to really seek training in music, he went well beyond what his grandfather could have taught him. And as it says in the biography, and as we know from different other traditions, went to look for a real master of music. And that was the famous Hazrat Khan, of which you must have read in the biography as well. And that was in Baroda, and it was there that he received a real professional training in music. Hazrat Khan being really a professional musician, a very great expert. And so Maula Bakhsh lived with him for a number of years, and people don't know exactly how long, but it might have been as long as 2 years that he underwent that training with Hazrat Khan. As long as he lived, Maula Bakhsh remained with him, only to start his musical career outside after he had inherited that all the competences Hazrat Khan would have given him. So then he went, using his Zamindari background, with everything that meant in, kind of etiquette, courtesy, style, all these things which you needed in court. Well, these Zamindars, of course, they had that same culture, so they could really go up to a court and say, well, here I am, and expect such a court to receive them properly. That he did, he traveled in many courts, and then first, of course, he was in North India because he was trained in the Hindustani music, that means the northern Indian style of music. But then, being an adventurous person, he did something rather revolutionary for a musician from the Hindustani style. He went to the south and was completely captivated by Dravidian India, which was different in language. Many different languages had nothing to do with the Hindi language of the north, which, as you know, are related to the Indo-Germanic languages. Hindi, Hindustani, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, all these languages over there have their links with the Indo-Germanic language. It used to be called the Aryan group. Rather frequently nowadays, people want to avoid that term, but all the same, linguistically, that remained one group with the European languages. And the Dravidians were totally different. They had something like 5 languages, and nobody yet, as far as I know, has ever been able to relate the Dravidian language to any other group of languages. And they're notably difficult, very hard to acquire if you're not born into them, but a very strongly marked Hindu culture. A number of great Hindu traditions were really especially marked in the south. And they always say that when Sri Krishna originally was a southern Indian deity, but taken over in the north as well. Anyway, this was a new kind of India, which Maula Bakhsh then came to know. And as I say, he was really delighted with everything he saw there, witnessed there, and traveled there quite a lot as well, and came to maybe the greatest court in southern India, that was Mysore. Mysore was a relatively great kingdom, And for a time, he settled there at the court, performing his music and trying to study that Dravidian music, which he felt was totally different from the music in the north. Very briefly put, the Hindustani music of the north was essentially a court music, very refined and very developed, very melodious, very rhythmically, very sophisticated, but it was typically music which went from guru to chela, from the teacher to the pupil. So the public, not public dispense, it was a kind of thing you had to sit to acquire from somebody and then it continued in that way. But it was also a bit indisciplined in that way. It was a bit very personal, a bit subjective, etc. So not a general standard which applied to everybody. Then he came to the Southern Indian music, and there he suddenly saw that music had a scientific basis, had a very theory for every aspect of Indian music, rag and tal, and what have you, all the different categories of the music. Technically, they had elaborate theories about that, and written works about that. And you probably all know the story that at the Mysore court, he made the acquaintance of the daughter of the Rajbakshi. Now, Rajbakshi was a kind of court's treasurer. And he had a daughter who was very well trained in this Brahmanical music. Because as I said, in the north, the classical music was that of the courts. In the south, the classical music was that of the Brahmins. And so there again, as I already mentioned several times in the course of the days, music and mysticism were two linked twins. And the Brahmin in the south considered music as, well, one of the ways in which they attained spiritual illumination, spiritual perfection, whatever way they were looking for the further stages of mysticism. So, Brahmanical music. And then this very learned person, the daughter of the Rajbakshi, we don't know her name, but anyway, Maula Bakhsh wished to become her pupil. She wanted to learn that music from her. And the lady refused. She said, but you're not a Brahmin. And that had nothing to do, mind you, that had nothing to do with religious prejudice. It had to do with the fact that Brahmins, that means the learned, people in the West always think that Brahmins are the priests of Hinduism. Well, you have certain Brahmins who are priests, but that is not a very well viewed occupation at all. Brahmins essentially were the intellectuals, they were the people of the written scriptures, they were the people of higher education. And every specialist in very different fields, those were Brahmins. You probably might know from the Mahabharata that even those people who were trained in weaponry, they were trained militarily, the man who taught them the Pandavas in the Mahabharata was himself a Brahmin. Drona was a Brahmin, but he taught the warlike disciplines to the Pandavas. So it was a whole category of people. It was perfectly normal that a Brahmin, or the Brahmins, would also cultivate music as their particular specialism. But in this case, this lady refused the young Maula Bakhsh to acquire that music. Said, wait for your next incarnation. If you will reincarnate as a Brahmin, yes, then we will admit you and give you all the music you want. Now, as I said, what was it that Maula Bakhsh wanted to acquire? Of course, the music as such. Of course, the very strong theoretic basis of the music, which, as I said, which also was written down, which was an important element in the South. But then, indeed, you must have found something there which had been preserved in the South and which was not at all there in the North, that the music as such could also be written down. Now, for us, that's a totally normal thing that music is written down in musical notes, etc. But in northern Hindustani music, it was something that was orally transmitted from a teacher to a pupil. That was not written down. You could write works about music, but the music as such was not noted down. And apparently, that was the case in the South. There they had some kind of ancient Sanskrit kind of way of still noting down the melodies and the rhythms of those songs. And the interesting part is that Maula Bakhsh didn't give up. From Mysore, he went even further south, the Travancore and these very southern regions in the south of India. And there he found a person, Subramani Iyer, who was a great Brahmin, an extremely orthodox Brahmin. And you will have read in the biography that he was so orthodox that he felt he had to purify himself with a bath. If any kind of lower class person, and the Shudras or the Parais, even felt a shadow of such a person fell on him, he had to be ritually purified. So extremely orthodox person, because this is, of course, a rarity. This kind of things only happen in the south, I suppose. But even so, he developed a kind of good relationship with Maula Bakhsh. And what we also hear about Maula Bakhsh, also in the stories, and you find indications in biography and wherever it is, he had that extraordinarily winning personality. Everything which we hear about Hazrat Inayat Khan, that big charisma, that kind of extraordinary kind of magnetic personality which drew everybody to him, but which he also presented to everybody, whoever it were. There was always that sense of friendliness, of courtesy, of a kind of very special relationship to anybody else. And so that was the same with Maula Bakhsh. It was essentially Hazrat Inayat Khan inherited, and in a sense probably even enhanced that particular winning quality which Maula Bakhsh had, which enabled him, for such an orthodox, strict Brahmin, yet to accept Maula Bakhsh as a pupil to that extent that he taught him his Brahmanical music. And although we have no written proof of that, it is easy to infer that one of the things which he taught them, apart from, of course, the music as such, also something about a notation, and a very archaic Sanskrit notation of noting down that kind of music. Because, as again, you will read it in the biography, this Brahmin, Subramani Iyer, took so much care of the manuscripts, he would never part from them. But he had all those manuscripts of music. And then it is said in the biography that these manuscripts contained all the precious songs of Dikshitar and Tyagaraja, which then were the great famed composers one generation previous or in the early 19th century. Those were the melodies and the songs which he taught to Maula Bakhsh. Those were the songs which later on Maula Bakhsh took back to Baroda, and those were the songs which Hazrat Inayat Khan and his brothers inherited from their grandfather. So this whole circuit of music ultimately landed in Baroda. So that was one side of Maula Bakhsh's achievements. And then you probably know that story that he went to Mysore. Once he had acquired that music, he went back to Mysore. And there at the court, he was really honored very greatly by that he now had become the master of the music. And even the Brahmins admitted that he had acquired such a superiority in that music that he really stood first, even among themselves. So that was a great achievement. And he was very richly honored by the Maharaja of Mysore, which gave him kind of status among the leading people in India. That was another acknowledgement which made him very famous. And then he went on traveling throughout India, trying then to develop a notation system for Indian music, as had been something of that he had learned in the south. Then, of course, he went to Bengal, and there, Bengal being very British, so they knew the English system of music notation. And some people, among them one of the Tagore family, of the Tagore, you know, Rabindranath Tagore was a great poet, but in the previous generation was one great Tagore who was a practicing musician also, and who had evolved with some other, assisted with some other people, assisting in developing a notation of music for Bengali songs. And along those lines, Maula Bakhsh later in Baroda tried to develop a system for his types of music and for songs, not only for the Bengali style songs, but also for the Hindustani music and Indian music generally. So that has always been considered one of his great achievements in his life. But then, having come to Baroda with all that enormous reputation for being the Grand Master of Indian music, because he combined the two styles, both the Hindustani and the Dravidian ones, and occasionally also composed songs or other music which combined the characteristics of both styles. Again, another accomplishment which is fairly unique to him. And so, but then he did something quite remarkable. And that was with the support of the Maharajas of Baroda, the Gaikwads, he opened a music academy. And what was so special? A music academy opened up to anybody who wanted to train either as a professional musician or just to be acquainted with music, not necessarily as a professional, but just to know something of the great Indian classical style. Everybody was welcome there. And that was a novelty, because I said music was transmitted only from a master to a pupil, both in the south and in the north. And suddenly they got this music academy where anybody could come and study Indian classical music. And so then Maula Bakhsh went further, and he wrote a number of textbooks for the students at that academy. His sons, Murtaza Khan and Aladdin Khan, wrote textbooks, and of course Inayat Khan, as you know, wrote a number of textbooks, which until very recent times are greatly appreciated, because in some of those books he includes a number of songs which otherwise have been almost forgotten. Nobody had noticed, has known a number of songs which Inayat Khan had collected in books which he then wrote, Inayat Kitabat Navali and a number of other books, where all this music has been preserved. So these books have been reprinted in India, in Baroda actually, where one of his, the then director of the Ganshala Academy, very much appreciated Inayat Khan's text and had reprinted. And there was a certain hope that maybe they might again be reprinted in the Western edition. You know that the greatest of all his books on music, that is the Urdu Nikaya Musica, which he wrote in Hyderabad, Inayat Khan, has recently been republished in America in English translation with the original texts. Very recommendable book for anybody who is interested in Indian music. And so, well, to return to Maula Bakhsh, that was the way in which he devoted his life, opening up the music to anybody who wished to learn that music. And that, as I said, was really revolutionary. And you could say the same thing has been done by Inayat Khan. One of the analogies between Inayat Khan and his grandfather was that Inayat Khan, to a large extent, opened up the teachings of Sufism to anybody who took the trouble to come and listen to them, or who read the books in which these teachings have been written down. Of course, many people, both in the Chishtiya Tariqa, which it was initiated, and the other Sufi orders, of course, you had great masters who wrote, but mostly those masters, whatever they wrote, the learning of that was confined to others who became a part of that order, that as part of that order, also acquired those written teachings, but something which deals both with the music as such, and then we can just say the ideological aspect of music. As you know from volume 2, the mysticism of sound and music, that was quite a new initiative. Everybody can read that. You don't need to be a member of Hazrat Inayat Khan's Sufi order or any of his organizations. The literature is just there, both on mysticism and on music. And anybody who has sufficient interest, time, whatever ability to acquire all that can simply just open a book and learn it all. So there again, you find the same revolutionary approach in music presentation of Sufism with what Maula Bakhsh did for Indian music, both northern, southern, in India itself. So there's some, of course, there are many anecdotes connected with Maula Bakhsh, and maybe one of them I could read, which is, I myself think is a typical one, characteristic of that spirit which Maula Bakhsh had in cultivating his music. Find a particular passage because it is it's an Indian four-line poetry, so it won't benefit talking at the heart. Well, thank you very much. So, as I said, when he had become so very well known through his great achievements in Mysore, where this Maharaja had ennobled him with a kind of princely rank, and so he became an extremely famous musician throughout India. All these Maharajas, they tried to draw him to their courts. And at first he didn't really react very much to it, but at last he let himself be persuaded to come back to Baroda, where he had studied anyway, where he was familiar also. And then Maharaja Khandirao very much asked him to come and become part of his court in Baroda state itself. So he did so, but things did not really work out as he had expected to, because Khandirao was a person who collected talents from all sides, wherever he could. Baroda was a small state, but a very rich one. So he could attract all kinds of talents in all fields of knowledge and art and political capabilities. All the best people assembled in Baroda. To give you one example, the famous Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, the man who later became so famous in Pondicherry as one of the great Indian philosophers. He started all his life in Baroda, where he had the college, which later was to become the Baroda University. He was the secretary to Maharaja, and he created, to this day in Baroda, we have that Aurobindo Center, which is one of the oases, because Baroda is about the best place to be. Very cool, very large, and extremely nice place to relax when the heat becomes a bit oppressive. So this was then all started, as I said, by Maula Bakhsh, in this case, returning to Baroda and accepting the invitation of Maharaja Khandirao to come and be attached to his court. But then, what happened? It says, Maula Bakhsh was now enjoying a period of great prosperity. Several ruling princes invited him to their courts, and he at last accepted the invitation of the Maharaja Khandirao of Baroda. Arrived at Baroda, he found, however, to his disappointment, that the Maharaja was less interested in music than in the fact that he attached the greatest singer of the day to his court. And Maula Bakhsh had to face opposition of the courtiers, who could not brook the fact that this singer expected to be treated on an equality with themselves. And the Maharaja on his side was disappointed in Maula Bakhsh, who did not feed his vanity with the subservience which he expected from those around him. At the court ceremonials and at the processions of state, Maula Bakhsh would appear with the marks of honor he had received in Mysore. The gold canopy held above his head, the stick of honor carried before him by a servant, and wearing the chaplet of pearls and the circlet of gold. The court officials, having pointed out that this musician gave himself almost royal rank, the Maharaja sent an ironical word to him, saying, "If you wear crown and scepter, then what shall the Rajas wear?" And Maula Bakhsh answered with a quotation from the Sanskrit. And the text goes like this, I'll give the translation. Swadesha Pujita Raja, Swagrama Pujita Prabhu, Swaraja Pujita Murka, Vidvanasam Samatra Pujayat. So the king is honored in his country, a chief is honored in his district, a fool is honored in his home. Mind you, this word was the time before emancipation, of course. So a fool is honored in his home, but a genius is honored everywhere. Your Highness, my kingdom is everywhere. Maula Bakhsh answered. And so then he was again put to the test, like he had been in my view, to prove that he really was the greatest of musicians. So in Baroda again organized a musical competition, and I believe that lasted for something like 9 months. The greatest professionals of all of India were called to perform, and Maula Bakhsh had to perform with them or against them in each and every case. And surprisingly, were all kinds of instruments, all kinds of singers, even a number of people of dramatic arts, very beautifully described in the biography. So if you are interested, I really can recommend you these very entertaining pages. And in fact, Maula Bakhsh, who had really mastered not only the practice, but also the theory of music, actually won from all of them. And so then he was still accepted as the greatest musician of his day. But then, of course, he had a certain disappointment with his cardinal when first got into his court and then kind of, confronted him with all these adults who were meant to beat him, but he could not be beaten. But then he left and he went to Hyderabad, and he spent the time in Hyderabad there. And he lived there for somebody, all of you know something of his Baroda home. In Hyderabad, he lived in a certain quarter of a certain area, which was called Yakutpura, which I think is the street of the jewels, isn't it? Yakut. The pearls and something. Huh? Ruby. Oh well. So the strait of the district of the rubies. So when he came to Baroda, and they acquired, by the standards of those days, a very large house. Again, standards of those days, of course, not a skyscraper of today, but a large house which had belonged to the Maharaja's treasurer. Strangely enough, those of you who know Baroda will know that you had these old walls of the old Baroda city. Right within the walls, you had that old wooden palace where the Maharajas lived before they started building British-type palaces. But just outside the walls was the treasury. His treasury and the jeweler was in charge of the treasury. Now, I've never understood if you have a treasury and you wish to guard it, you go and put it outside the walls. Nobody could explain why that was the case. And my only explanation is that Baroda must have been military very strong, or so honest and so confident that nobody could touch them, that he just kept the jewels outside. Anyway, he acquired that. By that time, the jeweler, the treasurer, had moved out. He had acquired his house and lived with all his family and his servants and everybody there. A totality of about 40 people, 40 to 50 people living there. And that whole Yakutpura area was really, it was an open space with that one large house standing there. And gradually it became a kind of mahalla, a kind of town area, starting with all the servants and the retinue of Maula Bakhsh and his wives and anything to do with Maula Bakhsh, with the Maula Bakhsh house and all the servants and retinue which then started managing, living there around him. So that was how this Yakutpura street and district was, in those days, was populated. How far that went, that sense of loyalty to the patriarch of Maula Bakhsh and how long his memory survived, that, well, let me tell a very strange kind of personal story. I'm sorry then to spoiled his text. But anyway, when I was in Baroda, you know, and I come from Holland, so my normal transport was go on bike. And my much preferred transport in Ostens was to go around on the bicycle. And it so happened that in the corner of the Yakutpur, as it then was, there was a shop of a person who had bicycles available. You could rent a bicycle there. And then, of course, as it happens in Baroda, I said, look, back to a bicycle, we'll go around in Baroda and go around. Then, of course, they didn't allow me to go there, but they sent one of the younger boys of the family, say, go and get a bike for your uncle. So that's what they did, and they put a bike. And all day long, I had a wonderful time going all over Baroda. Of course, you have to keep clear of the traffic. Of course, in Baroda, there are lots of cars and no traffic rules. But anyway, you know, where you're judged anyway, take it in your stride, I suppose. And so then in the evening, I brought back that bike. And again, that boy went going to get home to rent the bike. Now he came back. And he asked the man who was in charge of that bike shop how much the charges were for this day. And this man said, no, nothing to be paid. You know, my grandmother heard that one of the family is having a bike, and she, as a young girl, her father was, you know, the coachman of the Maula Bakhsh house. And my grandmother, a young girl, was in charge of, you know, bringing the hay and everything these horses needed to help her father in caring for these horses. So we were their employees. So we were loyal to them. So we could not think of one descendant of the family to charge him for using a bike. Now, as I said, the feudal tradition in India suddenly broke off with the proclamation of the Republic in 1947, and not with this change in Europe, even with the French Revolution, with ideas and the practice of the ideas still took many decades, maybe even a few centuries before these developments reached their modern stage. But in India, everything happened in one go, just at once. The one moment you had feudal India, the next moment you had the Socialist Republic. So, well, I won't elaborate on that because that has been quite a painful operation for many people in many different circumstances. So let us go back to Maula Bakhsh, who was still in the midst of this tradition of Kandilal. He left, as I said, Baroda, he went to Hyderabad, he spent the time there. But what he took from Hyderabad was that name for his own home, Yakutpura, then became the name of his residence. His residence had a different name, Lakha, but it was that area in which the house stood, then acquired that name, Yakutpura. And so that was the tradition here. And yes, the one, then he also, Maula Bakhsh, by that time being such a famous musician and also seen as a national musician because he combined these two great different styles. As I said, the Hindustani in the north and the Carnatic, the so-called Carnatic music in the south. And it was a unique achievement, and moreover, he had quite a number of the most classical songs of that Indian tradition, which were part of the repertoire. So he was really a very greatly in demand. And so through Tagore in Calcutta, which then was the capital of British India, was then Delhi, but it was in Baroda, then he oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, yes. Excuse me, yes. I was just saying that Maula Bakhsh, being such a famous musician in both the northern and the southern styles, which in those days was quite unique. So he became very well known, very famous. And so he was invited and by the British Governor General. You had one official in India who was the Governor General of British India and the Viceroy in relation to the Indian states. You had the double function, Viceroy for the Indian states and Governor General for the British provinces there. And I believe it was on that occasion that then Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. As you know, at the most unfortunate moment, especially the French will not remember that with any pleasure, the German Empire was proclaimed. God was proclaimed in France, a very unpleasant kind of thing to be happening, of course. But then when this German Wilhelm had proclaimed himself, or was being proclaimed as Emperor of Germany, then of course Queen Victoria could not remain a Queen of England. So they needed an empress. So for the sake of being equal to the German and the Russian emperors, she was proclaimed Empress of India. That's the way things happened.
A big statue in the middle of the country.
Yeah, exactly. Everything was status in those days. So Maula Bakhsh was invited there, and when he was there, and actually then the viceroy or the governor general apparently gave him a kind of titular capacity as professor of Indian music. Now there was hardly any place where a professor in those days could teach music, but he had the title anyway. And then later, when he came to Baroda, that Ghanshala Academy was created, and so that was the function. The title also got a function. Anyway, but then he also went. He was always invited to all the different states. He traveled all over India, and so he was invited in Jaipur. And Jaipur was one of the great Rajputana states, the country of the Rajputs, northwestern India. And among the states, Jaipur was a very prominent one. And he was invited there and received very cordially again by the Maharaja. But then Maharaja said, Maula Bakhsh, when we were having the imperial darbar in Kolkata, we, the princes of the land, were standing. You were sitting. If the governor general, the viceroy gave you such honor that you could sit in a chair, whereas we, the rulers, were standing, if you got so much honor from the viceroy, what on earth can I do to honor you? Nothing remains for me. Any more honor I can give you. The honor he gave with those words, of course. But there again, typical what that kind of fame of Maula Bakhsh had become in India. So he was, in that way, an extraordinary personality. And for Hazrat Inayat Khan, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to build upon that personality of Maula Bakhsh and continue his tradition in music and maybe in social life and the general. But Inayat Khan did not do that. His own talent, his own destiny, his own impulses really ultimately went in a different direction. And of course, you get this problem if you have a truly genius of a personality in your family. And of course, the Indian tradition always is, and that's part of the social structure of India generally. If you're a very great person in your lineage, in your family, then it becomes your dharma to continue that tradition. Not necessarily at the level of that person, because the assumption is that the person was so advanced that you couldn't really equal it, but you have to continue in the same line, in the same tradition, and keep alive the name and the reputation of that great ancestor. But the whole Indian society lived according to these rules, and that could be art, but it could be science, it could be even also manual things, people who had some kind of trade in which they excelled. And at every level, that is the lineage, the children of such a family who is duty. And that is what Indians understand by Dharma. Dharma is not a general rule for everybody. It is for a specific group of people. It's a specific set of duties which make that group of people a distinctive identity. So that was a great event. And the dilemma, of course, if you got such a great personality in your family, what do you do? How do you continue? What's the way in which you continue that? There was already a Ghanshala in which his music had been good. So how do you go on? And so Maula Bakhsh's eldest son continued in his style, and his age was also his heir. He was a successor, so he had reason to do that, Murtuza Khan. And then his younger son became completely British. He studied in Europe during the Belle Epoque, the 1890s, was completely won over by European civilization. They went back to India and represented that kind of very Anglicized Indian, which then had played a certain role in Indian history as well. So the one broadened out into Anglicization, and Hazrat Inayat Khan deepened, as for music, into his mysticism. So both had a different line and a different expertise in which they continued Maula Bakhsh's tradition. And of course, the heir ultimately par excellence of Maula Bakhsh has been Inayat Khan. The way he continued everything which his grandfather had begun with. So, I mean, what I've said up to now is very fragmentary, of course. That's worth reading in the biography, everything you can read yourself about his life if you're interested in it. But how everything in Maula Bakhsh's life anticipated things which recur in Inayat Khan's life is quite striking, it's quite remarkable. So, in that sense, it remains worth in the history of Inayat Khan, in the history of Sufism also, always like Inayat Khan himself and like his brothers in their way, always to remember this genius of a personality which their family history really commenced. The tradition of this family really commenced with Maula Bakhsh and continued, of course, up to the height of Hazrat Inayat Khan and everything he represented. So, what I've said is also very fragmentary, but I realize I've been already talking for very long, maybe longer for you not to become sleepy. But anyway, if anybody is interested to know something particular about him, I will be very glad to answer to that.
How many children? About 4 children.
You mean Maula Bakhsh?
Yeah.
Maula Bakhsh had 2 sons. Murtuza Khan, who was his heir and his successor in the family honors and also in the land and the properties, then had a younger son, Alauddin Khan, who was the one who was Anglicized so very well, the kind of English element in the family, which caused quite a bit of, excitement, let us say. I should not say disorder, that would be too far, but all the nephews were immensely interested. Inayat Khan, Mahmood Khan, Ali Khan, they were terribly interested in all the innovation which that uncle from Europe could bring to them. And so he was very much also a person who inspired their wish to go and see for themselves what Europe and what Britain were like. So that were 2 sons. Then he had 3 daughters, and one was Fatima B, and she had 1 daughter, and she died then. And then Rahmat Khan was really in despair, and he wanted to leave. He wanted to leave Baroda because he had lost his wife. And what should he do there? But the Maula Bakhsh still persuaded him to remain. Maula was very fond of Rahmat Khan, and so he said, "Please remain and remain part of my family also," because Maula Bakhsh, by his own elevation, had started a new lineage, a new family line. And to strengthen the family line, he didn't only want the descendants of his 2 sons, but also his daughters and their descendants to continue as part of his family. So his daughters also would not marry outside, he should find a husband prepared to join them in that family. How do you call that? So I got something, Damadigar. So Damadigar, the son of the house, they had to become as a condition to marry one of the daughters. So Rahmat Khan wanted to leave. Maula Bakhsh insisted that he ought to remain. And actually then he married also the 2nd daughter of Maula Bakhsh, that was Khatija B, and she became the mother of Inayat Khan and Mahmood Khan and Mashaik. So these 3 daughters were there. But Murtuza Khan was the eldest one. And then you got Alauddin Khan, who was again the son of Murtuza Khan, and who had that famous incident that Inayat Khan in the 1920s, just 100 years ago, hoped to effect a marriage between Alauddin Khan and his elder daughter Nur Nisa, because they very little difference in age between them, whereas the age of Hazrat Khan with Maula Bakhsh Inayat Khan was very great, something like 20, 25 years, which was very close in age to this 6, 7 years, something like that. So he would hope to affect the marriage between them. That fell through ultimately, although the engagement had already been arranged and celebrated in Baroda. They were in Baroda, there was an engagement with them due to all kinds of reasons which had nothing to do with either either Mahmood with a lot of time, or kind of different family politics ultimately that did not take place. And so, well, that was the pity of that story, of course. But anyway, I can say you that, of course, Hazrat Khan then married elsewhere, very, very nice person he married, and the daughter of this couple sitting here next to me. You might have met her meanwhile. So both myself and Zia tried to restore, to bridge over the difference that had been there, but the falling through of that engagement with Nissa. And so through our marriages, again, tried to re-establish contact with the family line, but also the family in Europe, which was not the only motivation. So it was not a purely political calculation. It was very much a personal preference as well, in most of our cases. But so that history ran in that way. But again, as long as we can hope that that will be a very long time, inshallah, indeed, that the name of Hazrat Inayat Khan and the wonderful way in which he, so to speak, translated Sufism with such a great Sufi tradition already present in the history of the East of India and of many other countries, how he quite spontaneously came to introduce that in Europe. And you already know the story. He intended to present exactly the Maula Bakhsh tradition of this combined national Indian music, the southern and northern together, and make known to the Europeans what a great value that Indian music was. They brought the West brought so many wonderful things to India at the material level, but at the cultural level, they were not aware of what India, for its part, could bring to the West. And that was a motivation that was very strong of a number of Indians. Think of Vivekananda, think of Sri Aurobindo, think of Tagore. All those people had this idea, all right, fine, the West brings a lot of things, but we have a culture which should be known in the West. The West must not think that we are at any need at that higher level of civilization. There they have nothing to offer us which we do not already have. And so that was the kind of motivation of Maula Bakhsh when he is invited to perform at that Viceroy's bar where the Queen Empress was being celebrated. Then at the same time, he tried his best to study Western music. So in order to be aware of how Western music, how that really ran, what was the values of those, etc. But at the same time, he also wanted the reverse movement, that in Europe, in America, in the West generally, Indian music in its classical style should also gain that acknowledgement of its value, of its culture, and of its general function in Indian civilization. Now, again, here, Hazrat Inayat Khan has been a pioneer because we know that Indian music generally only became very well known and now, of course, very respected and also very much liked in a much later generation. That was the people after the Second World War who started coming to Europe and looking performances. And then by that time, increasing numbers of people started to appreciate Indian music. In the 1920s, people said, as you know, well, yes, that music is fine to hear it once or twice, but what you tell about the music and the spiritual connection, that is something which really interests us. Not the sound of music, but the sound of the association of music with spiritual life. That is about that. And so in that entirely spontaneous way, and we cannot emphasize that enough, how spontaneous that development of Sufism in Europe was. And that whole story that he went out of India because his master, his Murshid had told him to go and spread Sufism in the West. That's pure mythology. That was an idealist mythology created by certain people who always wanted to know better in the 1920s. But actually, at the very attraction, and even in the style of Murshid's mode of speech, you find it back, that was what kind of inspired spontaneity. That was the way these things came about. And that was how he traveled to the West, not those intended 2 or 3 years that they wanted to make the grand tour of the West, but it continued for 16 years in the case of Murshid himself, and in the case of his brothers, it became lifelong. All completely unforeseen when they left, the three of them, in India in 1910. And as I say, that memory of the grandfather traveled with them wherever they went. I've told you already that we witnessed that, speaking about the family in Baroda, speaking about Roda itself, speaking about everything that happened in their Indian environment in those days, was an almost a daily conversation between Shaikh Maula Bakhsh and Mashaik, and when he joined them after the war of Mushraf. So that was always there. And of course, in that means that also Maula Bakhsh, who they refer to him as Nana Bakhsh, but that means the grandfather on the maternal side, that he was a constant feature in the conversations. These are wonderful memories because they went together with such a load of feeling and such a load of emotion. These conversations went on as real live memories. And even if you know very little of the language in which it happened, whatever I know, the little I know about Hindustani is by listening to them. Yes, that's very fascinating how they could evoke the world they had lived in, and obviously I'd be very happy in those days.
Inayat used to tell us a story, and it was a story of a little boy who wanted to learn music, and he didn't have access to the teacher, and he sat outside of the room with the teacher during months and months and months, and he learned by heart music. And then when the teacher met this young boy, played the music like the teacher.
Yes.
Was he speaking of Maula Bakhsh, or who was he speaking?
Exactly, that was Maula Bakhsh. Oh. I didn't tell the story because I thought it might be well known and people might already know things. But that is in the biography also. Okay. And he actually, the strange thing is, when he got that, he sang for the dervish in the home of his uncle, and then he got that name of Maula Bakhsh. After he did not at once react. He still stayed about 3 years, he remained there. And you see that uncle with him, who had got his parents had died early in the 1830s. And then when he was educated by his uncle and his aunt, of course, I don't think they had children of their own, though they expected Maula Bakhsh to be their heir of the lands which they owned there. And so they didn't want him to leave. And so Maula Bakhsh could acquire some music from his maternal grandfather, who was again a musician, not a performer, but still a musician. But then he wanted somebody he could really learn from. And he had to wait for an opportunity to be able to leave, to get his uncle's permission to leave. And so it happened that his sister was going to be married to a man from another town. And so the sister and the whole retinue of people went to celebrate her marriage in that particular other town where this marriage was going to take place. And so that was the opportunity for Maula Bakhsh, Shaikh, to come along, because of course you had to assist to his sister's wedding. And with him was also his maternal uncle. And then, after all the celebrations had been done, he and his maternal uncle left the party and went their own way looking for a music teacher. And so then he arrived at Baroda. And there you had Hazrat Khan. And Hazrat Khan was a very, very famous musician, a very great man in music as well, a northern music of us, but still a very well-known person, who never accepted any pupil at all. And then, but don't I read this after all? I've got, I will read this to you. If we have time and if everybody agrees, then let me read that passage for you. It's quite amusing, actually. He went there, and so it goes like this in the biography of Maula Bakhsh. Hazrat Khan was at that time one of the most accomplished singers of India and the most considered and talented in Gujarat. Gujarat, of course, is the province where the state of Maroda was. It must be remembered that in India, where science and art are considered sacred and hereditary possessions, it is not usual for an artist to part with his knowledge to any chance pupil. An artist will consider his art in the same light as his family honor and will pass it on to his heir, or failing an heir, will allow it to die with him. Moreover, in India, the great artist will not display his talent before large and mixed audiences. He reserves his art for the discriminating few. Hazrat Khan was a wealthy man, and though acclaimed in Gujarat as a master, he had never had a pupil. The young Maula Bakhsh, unknown though he was, a beginner, and on the very threshold of his career, felt an overwhelming desire to hear the music of this famous man and cast about in his mind how he should approach him. He hung about his house and, as always, being so friendly and sociable, soon made friends with the porter of the house of Hazrat Khan. Then he found, as he sat in the porter's little shelter, that from there he was able to hear every note, every variation of the master's voice, as he practiced and composed and improvised. And so, day after day, Maula Bakhsh came to the porter's lodge and talked to him and amused him with stories and jokes until the opium-sodden servant would doze off. The porter had the fortunate habit of taking opium, and so he would go fall asleep. Would doze off, trusting to the boy to wake him up should any occasion arise. And then Maula Bakhsh would give himself up to listening to the voice that issued from the house. In this way, for many months, Maula Bakhsh studied, and each day, after listening and noting all he heard, he would practice, modeling his own singing upon that of Hazrat Khan. One day it happened that he was practicing industriously, that Hazrat Khan passed his house and stopped to listen. It seemed to him that it was one of his own compositions that he heard, and moreover, one that he had not yet sung to anybody. He listened, and his curiosity was so aroused that he entered the house where Maula Bakhsh lodged and spoke to the young singer. "Continue your singing," he said to him. But Maula Bakhsh was dumbfounded. "May I ask who your teacher is, young man?" "My teacher is great indeed, truly," said Maula Bakhsh, "but if I reveal his name to you, then indeed my hope of progressing further under him must be given up. Who ever heard of such a teacher? Said Hazrat Khan impatiently. What teacher forbids his pupil to speak of him? Since you urge it, I will tell you. It is yourself. You are my teacher. Why? I've never seen you before. Then Maula Bakhsh explained what he had done. And as Hazrat Khan listened and stood there wondering at such perseverance and patience, the young musician continued, but now what chiefly grieves me is the thought that when I leave, for now I cannot go on listening to you as I did before. When I leave, I must say that it is from you that I have learned. For indeed, I have not yet studied long enough, nor gained enough of your knowledge to be worthy of being called the pupil of such a master as yourself. It was this point of view that interested and pleased Hazrat Khan, and he invited Maula Bakhsh to learn from him. This anecdote illustrates many sides of the character of Maula Bakhsh, but suggests perhaps more than anything else that there was in him an irresistible personality, which indeed his life seems to prove, that neither misfortune nor difficulty ever was able to diminish. That the proud and reserved man should accept the tuition of this unknown lad was in itself a matter of surprise. And what a teacher did he prove himself. There was nothing of his art which the master withheld from Maula Bakhsh, the only pupil he ever accepted. When he died, Maula Bakhsh, who stayed with him until his death, was a living record of his accomplishments. Then Maula Bakhsh traveled from court to court, who would seem to the young man a triumphal procession. For every way he met with praises and rewards, such as filled his ardent spirit with contentment and joy in existence and the pursuit of his chosen art. Then comes the story of his in Mysore. He's going to Mysore and being rebuffed by that learned lady in the court and everything that happened after. If you wish to learn, then wish to learn that lady without a name, but if you wish to learn, she said to him, then you must learn when you are born again at present. You must wait until a future reincarnation. This answer seemed to him so hard, and this point of view so inhuman, since he himself was such a devoted disciple of music that Maula Bakhsh felt he could not tolerate the atmosphere of the court any longer. And so he once more set out on his wanderings. So then he met the Subarli Iyer in Malabar, in southern India, and from there he never looked back. Well, very charming stories later in the biography of Hazrat Inayat Khan, being such a young man and already coming so quick in the care of Maula Bakhsh. Already from the earliest time there was that kind of rapport between the grandfather and the grandson. And of course, another lucky thing was that, as I said, not only Maula Bakhsh said that his daughters should marry with people, with men who were prepared to become a part of his household, but also that in a sense was a part of the Dravidian tradition, where the matrilineal lineage is a certain of the Hindu castes still very strong. Not all of them, but there are certain notable castes which remain matrilineal, and that has left in India generally a fairly strong accent on the descent in the female line. For instance, am I right, Haroon? Please tell me. I believe it is so for the naming of a child. I think the mother's family is very important, isn't it? And very often the uncles on the mother's side, when there are daughters, they support the marriage of the daughters, the daughters, their sisters, and so on. So that matrilineal line, though of course not dominant in patriarchal societies, still in India has a very strong emphasis. And so that makes it more natural, more understanding that Maula Bakhsh insisted that his daughters and their descendants must be descendants of his family, must join his lineage and continue to represent his lineage. So ultimately, that's making a very big jump from a very treasured past to a very recent times. Ultimately, it was after I told you, Murtuza Khan, the eldest son of Maula Bakhsh, who became his main heir and his main successor. But as far as the family honors is concerned, that means the rank he inherited from Mysore, he received in Mysore, the corresponding rank he later received in Baroda, and all these kind of what you call the family honors, those ultimately landed through a whole series of negotiations with Hazrat Khan and other measures and ideas, landed with Pirzia. So Pirzia now is, well, so many years representative of Maula Bakhsh, and this is why in our organization we never omit Pirzia Inayat Khan, Maula Bakhsh, because now he has to continue the dual identity of his father and of his father's grandfather. And if you read the biography again and look into the chapters dealing Hazrat Inayat Khan's boyhood, a young age, you see that he constantly has that special linkage with his grandfather. He goes to him, learns from him, and Maula Bakhsh himself also took the initiative in teaching that young boy in the morning, teaching him music. So there was that continuous relationship between them, in a way as the younger brother, Mahmood Khan, was most strongly related to the father, Ahmad Khan. Inayat Khan was most strongly related to the grandfather, Maula Bakhsh. And so both of these old patriarchs are part of the family history of Inayat Khan, and as such deserve to be remembered. And of course, be remembered to the music also. Numbers of Maula Bakhsh songs have been composed by Shaikh Mahmood Khan, and for Western voice and piano. And I must say that makes it very much easier to understand for ears that have been accustomed to Western music. If you have not developed an ear for Indian music, then it's not that easy to perceive the melodic line and the rhythmic niceties, and so really perceive that music as you would perceive Western music. And so by giving it a harmony, to compose it in harmony, 4-part harmony, as Western music is, giving it also an harmonic base on the piano and a Western style of singing, that the same song, which you find it pretty hard to understand whether the song the Indian way with Indian instrument, suddenly becomes much more understandable. And I might have told you the story already, but maybe let me repeat it in this case. Mahmood Khan was very interested in Western music. He already in Baroda had practiced piano playing with his uncle. And on coming to the West, he wanted to continue his studies in Western harmony and composition. And so he did so was in France with Monsieur Baillet, mentioned the other day, a Frenchman who loved Indian music, but taught Mahmood Khan further Western music and all details of that kind. Later in England, he continued that again. But then in France, there was a famous pianist, Walter Corona. He was the star pianist in those days. And they was friend. Here in France, they were very appreciated for their music, which Mohsin Inayat Khan very much records in his lectures also. And so this was about Mahmood had made some compositions Western style, some kind of symphonic piano piece or something like this. And so he brought that to Walter Rommel and said, look, I've tried my hand in some composition Western style. Please give me your criticism. Please tell me what you think of them. And Rommel said, oh, you know, we have so much Western music already. Why do you have to add to it? No, but you should go make your Indian music understandable by putting it in a Western shape so that we can learn to appreciate Indian music by the medium of Western instrument and Western style voice. And so that's what Mahmoud Khan did. So in the same way, Walter Rommel, focused Mahmoud Khan's music from Western music to the Eastern music, of which he became the grandmaster in all these songs which he wrote. In the same way that Mohsin Inayat Khan was induced to speak more about Sufism and less music by his first pupil in California, Rabbi Martin. He said, well, yes, that music is nice, I would like to learn it, but what you said about the music, that spiritual dimension, that's what I really want to learn. And so the balance gradually, not all at once, but gradually the emphasis of his music, of his work, shifted from music to Sufism. And again, completely spontaneous. And the very fact that it was so spontaneous gives that very particular side to his work. It's all the inspiration of the moment. It's all what he just was, yes, what he didn't intend to do, but he was happy to do when the opportunity arose. So there may be somebody who wants to discipline me.
I just have one small question.
Yeah.
I just...
Yes. 16 years old. I see. I see. About 130 years. Well, that's remarkable. Well, not really this one, but that's fine. But if the songs of Mohsin Inayat Khan are there, therefore maybe a couple of minutes or a couple of songs, not all of them, because it's easy to understand. But if you can do some 1, 2, 3 plays like this, that's very nice. I'm glad. So now we're still here. We're looking for some sorts of Maula Bakhsh. We couldn't find it that fast. But anyways, there have been these recordings of Mohsin Inayat Khan made in 1999 at Calcutta and recovered just some time ago by a number of researchers. And they made these new CDs from them. And of course, they have been very much, people have been very fond of them, but they are not all that easy to understand. They are still Indian songs sung in an Indian style. And moreover, during those days that they were made, the fashion for Indian music happened to be to sing it very fast. So just as a few instances, you can hear Mohsin's voice singing according to the style of the time in a very fast style, very agile. And again, like yesterday, Mahmoud Khan's music, just very short. These recordings are something like 3 minutes. So you have to get a lot of music out in those 3 minutes of the recording. But anyway, I think it is of great value that these documents are there.